again, football fans, and in this video we're going to take a look at a very memorable football team from my youth. In a very memorable season, I'm talking about the 1998 Minnesota Vikings, a team that was oh so close to perfect. A team that many, and by that I mean mostly their long-suffering fans, are ready to see take the top of the mountain. Established stars, a QB many had given up any hope on, a young charismatic star receiver joining one of the all-time greats on the opposite end, plus a strong defense, even one of the best kickers in the game. This team just about had it all. Time for a little backstory for context. The Vikings entered the league in 1960, the same year as a matter of fact as the Dallas Cowboys. In the late 60s, the Vikings were contenders, and at the helm was one of the greatest QBs of all time, Fran Tarkenton. But the heart of the team was that incredible defensive line known as the Purple People Eaters, Gary Larson, Jim Marshall, and Hall of Famers Carl Eller and Alan Page. Later on, Doug Sutherland would be a strong force on this line as well. The Vikings made the Super Bowl 4 times, Super Bowls 4, 8, 9, and 11. They would lose to the Chiefs, Dolphins, Steelers, and Raiders respectively. Some say they were the Buffalo Bills before the dynasty of the 1990s, if you will. The AFC dynasty, of course, I'm referring to. Also, I have to say the Chiefs win might have been a bit of an upset, but the other three teams were all infamous in the annals of NFL history to this very day, and not to be anything ashamed of in terms of losing to them. The 80s were hit or miss for the Vikings as they made the playoffs 5 times. They did have a couple serious contenders in the late 80s, but could never reach any significant playoff heights otherwise, besides one NFC Championship appearance. However, Chris Dolman became one of the most popular players in the team's history. As the 90s came about, however, questionable moves from general manager Mike Lynn ultimately cost him his job. Enter Jeff Diamond. And a new coach came in 1992, Dennis Green. Green was a receivers coach in San Francisco where he got himself a Super Bowl ring, so the receiving corps is his specialty. Keep that in mind. The team obtained Chris Carter from the Philadelphia Eagles in 1990, a highly gifted receiver who hadn't yet scratched the surface of what he could do. They also had added some good young talent, like defensive tackle John Randall. They also had a formidable offensive line led by Randall McDaniel. Despite a great season in 1992, they suffered more playoff failure. But in 1993, they drafted Robert Smith, a running back out of Ohio State. Also, a towering center by the name of Jeff Christie added more depth to their offensive line that year. And star running back, however, Terry Allen, had injuries that hurt the team, but they still clinched a wildcard spot in 1993. They also desperately needed a star quarterback. The Vikings since the 80s have had many talented QBs come and go, but they needed someone to really take them to another level and never had that type of quarterback, well, pretty much since Tarkenton retired. In 1994, they drafted someone else to add more depth to their offensive line, Todd Stuzzi. And they got the QB of their dreams, 6-time Pro Bowler from Houston, indeed Warren Moon, who was pushing 37 years old but playing like he was 27. Also, the defense was growing thanks to a very underrated linebacker named Ed McDaniel. Moon racked up some great numbers, but nothing came of it. He spent 3 seasons in Minnesota, they made the playoffs twice, and didn't win a single playoff game. The Warren Moon era was over after 1996, just 3 seasons. In 1987, the Vikings made an interesting signing. 3-time Pro Bowl quarterback who spent 11 seasons with the Philadelphia Eagles, Randall Cunningham. Cunningham had seemingly retired after not playing at all in the 1996 season, but the Vikings signed him to a contract in 1997. Considered to be one of the best multi-talented QBs in the league, Cunningham was also one of the best running quarterbacks in the game of his era. But also as the 90s wore on, injuries began to take their toll, and while he did win NFL's Comeback Player of the Year award in 1992 after missing all of 1991 due to injury-filled 1993 and a so-so 1994, where the Eagles crumbled, kind of started to cost Cunningham his clout. In 1995, he again dealt with injuries and lost his starting job to Rodney Peete. After a year away, he's back. But not in a starting role. Brad Johnson has been waiting in the wings for quite some time and finally got his shot after Warren Moon got hurt in the prior season. However, he finally got the chance to be the tried and true #1 guy for the 1997 season. Cunningham seemed fine with his role as a backup, and Johnson did pretty well in 1997. He helped the Vikings once again to the playoffs, but it was actually Cunningham who led them to their first playoff victory since 1988, in a bit of an upset over the New York Giants, but they sadly fell to a very stacked San Francisco 49ers team. Then came the big day, the 1998 NFL Draft, the infamous draft, of course, noted for the hype between 2 quarterbacks and who would go #1 exactly, Peyton Manning or Ryan Leaf. And indeed, one of the most anticipated drafts in NFL history, not to mention a draft class that also featured Charles Woodson, Fred Taylor, Greg Ellis, Kyle Turley, Troy Thomas, Keith Brooking, and Alan Faneca, and oh yes, one of the coolest names ever, Takeo Spikes. Well, it was a draft that even saw future Pro Bowlers being drafted as far as the 6th round, but I digress. The analysts from ESPN were thinking wide receiver out of Marshall, Randy Moss, would be taken very high. However, it was acknowledged that some of Moss's antics both on and off the field were very troubling to many teams who were turned off by him. Well, only one receiver, that being Kevin Dyson of the Tennessee Oilers, was taken before him. Experts were starting to feel as if they were missing out on a gold mine, but when the Vikings pick came in at number 21, they took Randy Moss. He could complement star wideout Chris Carter. As I mentioned, Dennis Green, being a former receivers coach, he knew what this was all about. In 2 years at Marshall, Moss had over 3,500 yards, receiving 54 touchdowns on 174 receptions. He had size, speed, quick hands, and great at eluding any given secondary. An NCAA Division I champion in 1996, in 1997 he was a consensus All-American, the Fred Biletnikoff Award winner for top receiver in college football, and the Mid-American Offensive Player of the Year, and also the Mid-American Conference MVP. The Minnesota Vikings in 1997 had the 11th ranked offense in the league out of 30 teams. Not at all bad. 14th on the pass, and Johnson did have the great Chris Carter to throw to, who had both his 5th straight 1,000-yard season and 5th straight Pro Bowl. But now with Moss to throw to as well, things can only improve. He led the league in receiving touchdowns and was 4th in receptions with 89. The Vikings running game, however, was ranked 6th in 1997, even better. That was thanks to former first-round pick Robert Smith, who finally had a breakout year after some were starting to feel he might be a bust. His 1,266 yards were 7th in the NFL that year. The Vikings defense, however, was only ranked 19, and they were a terrible 29th against the pass. Jimmy Hitchcock, Orlando Thomas, and Robert Griffith all had talent, but still hadn't brought it all together. Against the rush, they were just 23rd. You had a talented linebacker at Ed McDaniel and Dixon Edwards. And hey, actually Edwards had won 3 Super Bowl rings with the Dallas Cowboys. They had a journeyman Bobby Houston in the club, but Dwayne Rudd would be their 3rd as a starter. Up front, you had John Randall. He was definitely their best defensive player, bar none. He led the NFL in sacks in 1997, 15.5 for the very first time. And like Carter, obtained his 5th straight Pro Bowl appearance. Going into 1998, the Vikings were seen as a team with a decent defense, somewhat, and a really good offense, but what Randy Moss would do in his rookie year would be the big question, as skepticism ran rampant across the NFL about what he would really turn out to be. Brad Johnson was a talented quarterback, but could he ascend among the elite best? They had a reliable backup, obviously, in Randall Cunningham, but could either one lead this team to prominence? The prognosis on Robert Smith looked great, and of course Chris Carter was still one of the best wideouts in the game. The big factor that should not be overlooked is that offensive line, who in 1987 gave up the 9th least sacks in the league. Not bad at all. You had multiple Pro Bowler Randall McDaniel, as well as Todd Stuzzi and center Jeff Christie were among the best cores in the league. Defense was the biggest question, however. I mean, sure, John Randall was one of the best defensive tackles in the game, but the linebacking core and defensive backs were still a giant question mark. But you had one of the best kickers in the game at this point now, former Steeler All-Star Gary Anderson, and a talented punter in Mitch Berger to top things off. The Vikings were deemed a team that would likely make the playoffs, but it would not make a very big impact. Translation, pretty much what they've been doing for the better part of a decade. Yes, the 1998 year for the NFL was one in general I definitely remember. An unforgettable year for fans indeed of the game. For one, you had 2 of the best running backs in the game just putting up utterly insane numbers. It was also the year of the quarterback, where not only ageless wonders such as John Elway coming off his first Super Bowl or Dan Marino were still staying consistent, they were just doing their thing and better than ever. Also, the top 2 draft picks making debuts, taking very different paths in their respective careers. Also, you had 2 of the all-around best in the game at this point. Brett Favre at his peak, and another ageless wonder racking up more insane numbers than Elway and Marino even, Steve Young. Not to mention, you got to throw Troy Aikman in there too. But the story was the QB comebacks of 1998. Well, Doug Flutie was simply making an NFL comeback, to be specific, as his first NFL tenure was deemed a pretty big failure back in the 80s. He returned after dominating the Canadian Football League and becoming a legend there for 8 seasons, and unexpectedly became the starter for the Buffalo Bills after an injury to their starter. Even though Vinny Testaverde was a Pro Bowler 2 years prior with Baltimore, he was now called to be a backup to Glenn Foley for the New York Jets, but then became a starter and had the best season of his career. Indeed, 1988 was a crazy newsmaker year in the NFL, but what waves could the Vikings possibly make? So here we go, Week 1. And it's exactly how the Vikings and their fans wanted it to go. Johnson played very well, throwing just 10 incompletions and 4 touchdown passes in a 31-7 win over the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But the man stealing the show in the first game was Randy Moss, not wasting any time quieting his skeptics. In the second quarter, caught a 48-yard touchdown pass to make it 14-0 in the first quarter. Then a 31-yard TD strike from Johnson made it 21-0, and a dominant win over this rising Bucs team at home in front of 62,000 fans was starting the season out the right way, as Moss's performance made highlight reels across the sports media in North America. The story of their first road game of the year against the young St. Louis Rams team was Robert Smith. What a game he had, with 23 carries for 179 yards, including a 74-yard TD run that made it 24-10 for the Vikings at halftime. But another big story was what happened later in the game. Brad Johnson suffered a sprained ankle. The Rams had tied it on a huge play, and after an 80-yard touchdown pass to Isaac Bruce, it was 31-31. Cunningham came in and led a drive that culminated in a 19-yard touchdown pass to Chris Carter, a 38-31 Vikings win. So, Cunningham gets his first start of the year against the Detroit Lions at home, who were struggling, and he looked solid in the outing, but the defense deserves a lot of the credit here as they recorded 5 sacks, led by John Randall and Ed McDaniel, while Barry Sanders was held to less than 75 yards, and believe me, in this era, that's a huge accomplishment. A 29-6 win, the Vikings are starting to make people kind of take notice of their record. And they took on a struggling Chicago Bears team on the road, and Cunningham was outstanding, throwing just 9 incompletions and 4 touchdown passes. And the Vikings are just making huge, exciting play after exciting play. Again, they were becoming prominent on highlight reels on sports news shows week after week. The offense wasn't just good, it was exciting. The scoring opened the game with a 67-yard pass and run play to Robert Smith. Even Gary Anderson had a flair for the excitement, hitting long field goals from 50 yards out. But the Bears did lead 21-10 at the half. But Cunningham starred, 19-yard pass to Glover, 35-yard pass to Carter, 44-yard pass to Moss. The Vikings won 31-28 over the Bears and moved to 4-0. However, here was the biggest test. The Green Bay Packers, 2-time defending NFC champions who just won a Super Bowl 2 seasons prior. They have the best QB in the game at this point, Brett Favre. And yes, the Packers were also 4-0, not to mention they had the Minister of Defense, Reggie White, a seasoned vet, one of the all-time greats, and a former teammate of Cunningham's, no less, could give the QB a long night. Some say the Vikings have had it very easy early on, and this will be their test as a team. And to be fair, that's somewhat accurate. And the stage, Monday Night Football. A huge audience in the confines of the unforgiving tundra at Lambeau Field. And oh yes, let's also not forget, this is one of the most heated rivalries in all of sports. The first quarter didn't see much excitement, but something seemed off about Favre's game, and the Vikings defense was actually getting to the star QB quite often. Whereas Vikings blockers were protecting Cunningham very well, as a 33-yard Gary Anderson field goal opened the game at 3-0, the Vikings leading after 1. After the Packers tied it early in the second quarter, the Vikings went wild. Cunningham, long pass to Jake Reed, 56-yard touchdown, it's 10-3. But then on the ensuing kickoff, Roll Preston returned it 101 yards from out of his own end zone, and the game just like that is tied 10-10. But then, just like that, once again, boom! 52-yard pass to Moss, boom! 24-yard pass to Smith. The Vikings lead 24-10 at the half. The only scoring in the third quarter was a field goal from Anderson, and then in the fourth, he notched another to give the Vikings a 30-10 lead. But then Cunningham to Moss! 44-yard TD pass. 37-10, the Vikings led in the fourth quarter in Green Bay, no less. Packers fans aren't really used to this kind of dominance in their home field. Brett Favre's night was finished, and backup Doug Peterson came in and made the score look a little bit better. But the Vikings won 37-24. They are 5-0, proving they are the real deal with a dominant win over their rivals. And the team that dominated the NFC for the last two seasons, no less. The game's outcome made major headlines. The Vikings are now truly seen as a Super Bowl contender. Let's see a deeper look. Randall Cunningham was outstanding. 4 touchdowns, over 400 yards passing, and again, making those big plays. Favre played terribly, however. 3 picks and was taken out of the game. Cunningham showed the world that he can still be every bit as great as he was during those glory years in Philly. The Packers had crazy issues with their running game all year due to injuries from Dorsey Levens. However, it does not discount Robert Smith playing another beauty with over 115 combined yards. And Randy Moss is already being called a lock for Rookie of the Year this early in the season. This is amazing to see why. 190 yards on just 5 catches, 2 more touchdowns, and his speed and efficient hands are just dazzling fans and pundits all across the league. And Chris Carter, hey, he's doing his thing. 119 yards catching, making any pattern work. Well, Green Bay receiver Antonio Freeman did well with 53 yards on 3 catches, but was contained otherwise throughout the game. Derek Alexander, not just John Randall, was the big star on the defensive line for this game, getting to Favre twice. And that Vikings offensive line deserves a lot of credit for containing Reggie White, keeping him at a reach from Cunningham. Well, the Vikings, after a bye week and that huge win, went right back to business, decimating a lowly Redskins team 41-7 at home, Smith with another 100-yard game on the ground. And then Barry Sanders and Robert Smith had a nice showdown, each playing huge games, but the Vikings again were just crushing the opposition, this time a 34-13 win over the Lions. And indeed, the Vikings were 7-0. Who would have thought a team with a supposed QB who wasn't meant to be their starter, supposedly washed up that is, a rookie receiver that many were skeptical on, of course, and with good reason, would lead such a great offense. A defense that was mediocre at best the year prior would step up their game to boot. Everything's just off the charts. Randall Cunningham in 6 games and 5 starts has had 1,427 yards passing, 14 touchdowns, and just 2 interceptions. It was completing nearly 60% of his passes. Yeah, not bad for a 35-year-old has-been. Robert Smith was continuing his momentum from last season, as in 7 games he had nearly 700 yards rushing already, averaging nearly 100 yards a game. Randy Moss, the rookie sensation who teams passed up on, was behaving well for the most part, and just scorching the competition with 541 yards in his first 7 career games, averaging 18 yards a catch. Chris Carter, the veteran Pro Bowler, is approaching 500 yards and also has 6 touchdowns. Defensive backs across the league were stymied by these 2 stars, both at different points of their careers, but still playing their best. The Vikings offensive line has only given up 12 sacks in the first 7 games, not bad at all, among the best in the league at this point. This offense was just utterly ridiculous all around. And the defense indeed has stepped up, still good against the run, just giving up 764 rushing yards, a solid rushing defense indeed. And QB rushers aplenty. Randall doing his thing. Derek Alexander, who's been a fan favorite for many years, was having an enormous year. Meanwhile, Ed McDaniel and Dwayne Rudd led that very underrated linebacking core that was actually starting to make some headlines, and they were doing well against the run. And hey, Rudd was actually great at causing fumbles to boot. The Vikings secondary had shown a lot of improvements, however. While they still gave up a fair share of yardage, they didn't really give up much in the end zone, and that's really all that matters. The team had 12 overall picks at this point. Robert Griffith already had 5, with 2 interception games. Corey Fuller was snagging passes out of nowhere, while Jimmy Hitchcock would not only make QBs and receivers pay, he'd also make sure he'd return it as far as he can with many yards. Even in kicking, Gary Anderson was perfect. Literally. He had made all 15 field goals he attempted at this point, as well as all his converts, of course, and he has 73 points overall. Well, the Mitch Berger, very reliable punter, the odds makers were changing their tune. The Vikings went from being picked to being a wildcard team from many thinking they can win this whole damn thing. Then came a Week 9 meeting with the team they began this historic run against, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who were struggling a bit this season. Despite showing some promise the year prior, they sat at 3-4. In the first quarter, the Bucs struck first on a Warwick Dunn TD, but then Robert Smith scampered and turned 9 yards out. It was tied 7-7 after the first quarter. However, Smith was being heavily contained by the Tampa defense most of this game, while Dunn, as well as star fullback Mike Allstott, were making life very difficult for that potent Vikings rush defense. The game continued to go back and forth in the second quarter as the Bucs went up 14-7. But then even though the Bucs defense had Chris Carter's number, as well as Randy Moss's to a lesser extent, they didn't have Jake Reeves. He had a great game and scored on a monster 44-yard TD pass from Cunningham. It was 14-14. Then the two teams exchanged field goals, and at the half it was 17-17. A little surprising to say the least. The Vikings have yet to have the lead in this game. That changed, however, in the third quarter, as the only score of that quarter was Cunningham engineering a 70-yard drive, which included Reed catching a 32-yard pass that eventually set up a 1-yard TD pass to him, his second major of the game. The Vikings now have the lead, and it stays that way after 3 quarters. But in the fourth quarter, a costly pick thrown by Cunningham leads to a 38-yard field goal as Tampa closes the gap to 4 points. But then the Vikings had trouble moving the ball and just couldn't muster up anything. Then, with just under 6 minutes to play, Mike Allstott drives in 6 yards and the Bucs lead 27-24. Cunningham, however, looked calm at a huge play to get them out of the deep in their zone. A 21-yard completion to Chris Carter, who had been quiet all game, was called back due to a very questionable offensive pass interference call. The Vikings never recovered as Cunningham was sacked to end the drive, and the Bucs ran out the clock. A shocking loss as many cried foul at the penalty, but the Vikings camp, for the most part, just didn't waste any time crying about it. Despite their perfect record coming to an end, this team was not going to dwell on one loss, despite how unexpected it may have been. Smith was held to just 46 yards on the ground, Carter was held to just 13 in receiving, while Moss had just over 50. The Vikings were killed on the run, Allstott and Dunn combined for over 200 yards. However, they didn't waste any time. They returned home with a victory against the inconsistent New Orleans Saints. However, early in the game, it wasn't good. On the first drive for the Vikings, Cunningham went down with a knee injury. This, of course, caused the Metrodome to go silent. In comes Brad Johnson, the man who hadn't taken a single snap since he was injured in Week 2. Well, Johnson was outstanding. He completed 28 passes with just 10 incompletions and throwing for over 300 yards. Reed and Glover had over 90 yards receiving, while Carter had over 70, while Moss had his worst game of the year with just 6. Robert Smith had 137 on the ground, including a 61-yard touchdown, and put the Vikings up 24-10. The Saints made a comeback to tie it, but Johnson engineered an 11-play, 81-yard drive that led to a Leroy Hoare TD, and with just under 4 minutes to play, and it was a 31-24 win for the Vikings. Johnson, however, suffered an injury in the win as the Vikings were about to host the lowly Cincinnati Bengals. Thankfully, however, Cunningham's injury was deemed only minor and was able to return as he, Moss, and Carter just destroyed the Bengals, and Derek Alexander had another big game with 2 sacks. And now test number 2, another game with their heated rivals, only this time at home. The Packers, and indeed the Packs still look pretty good at 7-3. In the first quarter, the Vikings struck first with a field goal, but later on, Jimmy Hitchcock intercepted a Brett Favre pass returning at 58 yards for a touchdown, and the Vikings led 10-0. Gary Anderson booted a field goal in the second to make it 13-0, but then the Pack got back in the game after Favre found Tyrone Davis from 12 yards out to close the gap to 6 points. After a 10-play, 76-yard drive, with 28 seconds left in the half, Cunningham finds Carter from 4 yards out. The Vikings take a 27 lead at halftime. After the third quarter, it remained the same, and the Packers were looking poised to come back, but couldn't get the ball in the end zone. In the fourth, however, Favre found Davis again to close the gap to 6, but then boom! To Moss from Cunningham, 2-point conversion, 28-14, and that's how it would stay. The Vikings go 2-0 against the Pack for the first time since 1993. Well, Favre did play a huge game, but Randall still got the win, and that's what matters, and played very well once again. On top of that, Randy Moss had 153 yards on 8 catches. There it is, huge momentum, 2-0 against our biggest rivals, and one of the most NFL storied teams at this point. And now the Vikings are 10-1. Yeah, needless to say, they're on their way to the playoffs without question. Then the next week came and Cunningham went head-to-head with a familiar foe, counterpart Troy Aikman and the Dallas Cowboys. The Cowboys were looking really good themselves at 8-3, but in a shootout, the Vikings were always in the driver's seat, and Randall took control. The receivers on both sides, however, put on a huge show, but the story was Randy Moss. 3 catches, 163 yards, all touchdowns. 2 each from 56 yards out, another from 51, while Carter had a 54-yard TD and 135 yards receiving, and Michael Irvin, to his credit, put on another show for the Cowboys with 137 yards, but it was the Vikings with a monster 46-36 win. The Vikings followed that up with a huge 48-22 win over the Bears, then a 38-28 win over the Ravens. Yeah, it doesn't have the same ring. And a monster 50-10 win over the Jaguars with over 400 yards of offense compared to just 226 for the Jags, where Randall had 2 sacks and Hitchcock had another pick. So let's see if our boys can close out the year very strong. And indeed they do. A 26-16 win over the Tennessee, not yet Titans, but still the Oilers. 15-1, the best record in Vikings history. Safe to say they won the NFC Central and also had the best record in the National Football League. Compared to last year, this 1998 Vikings defense does not get as much credit as it should for the improvements drastically that it made. The defense was 6th this year compared to 19th the year before, giving up the 6th least amount of points out of 30 teams. While they gave up a lot of passing yardage, the secondary improved from 29th to 19th, and most importantly didn't give up a lot of points. They were 11th in the league with 19 interceptions overall as well. Ed McDaniel had a great year leading the linebacking core, while John Randall and Derek Alexander made life hell for QBs on the pass rush. And speaking of the rush, the Vikings were 11th against the rush compared to 23 the year prior. And that offense, oh yes, the best offense, best in the NFL. Are you surprised? #1 on the pass compared to 14th last year. They slipped a bit on the rush, but Smith still had an incredible year, and 11th is not bad. But regardless, this was the most dangerous offensive core in the league, no matter how you see it. Leading, of course, to the NFL record of points scored in a season, 556. Yes, I repeat, an NFL record. This team, I reiterate, were not supposed to be this good. While they had one star receiver in Carter already, a running back who finally broke out the year prior, and a very good offensive line, Brad Johnson wasn't fully proven as a quarterback. And they had to trust now their 35-year-old backup, who again, I reiterate, was deemed washed up and only good enough to be a backup, and hadn't had a great season since 1992, while their top draft pick, Randy Moss, dropped in the draft, was considered a liability in the defense. Average at best, right? Cunningham had arguably the best year of his career. 3,704 yards passing, 5th in the entire NFL. Also just 104 yards short of his career high in 1988. 34 passing touchdowns, good enough for 2nd in the entire league, only 2 behind Steve Young for 1st, and 3 ahead of Brett Favre, who was in 3rd. Also a personal career high, beating his previous mark of 30 in 1990. His 106.0 passer rating, tops in the NFL, ahead of the likes of Vinny Testaverde, who had a big comeback year, Steve Young in 3rd, who often did well in this category, Falcons quarterback Chris Chandler at 4, and the ageless John Elway, who rounds out the top 5. I should point out, Cunningham only threw 10 interceptions this year and had a 60.9 completion percentage, 6th best in the NFL on top of that. And he was runner-up for league MVP, 3rd time he'd been runner-up, as a matter of fact, in his career. He lost the award to Terrell Davis of the Broncos, who had a 2,000-yard rushing season. He also lost to Davis for the Offensive Player of the Year and was a runner-up for that. And was also a runner-up of Comeback of the Year, which was awarded to Doug Flutie of the Bills, very well deserving. However, there's something that Cunningham wasn't a runner-up to, and that's being named, basically, for the first time in his career, a first-team All-Pro. He'd been a second-team All-Pro in 1988 and 92, but he truly was the best overall QB in 1998 in the entire league. A huge accomplishment. And those receivers, those receivers. Randy Moss was 3rd in the entire league in receiving yards, behind 2 of the best of the time, Eric Moulds and Antonio Freeman at #1. He was just over 100 yards away from setting a rookie record in a season, but the highlight reel he put together still lives on to this very day. Moss's 17 touchdowns not only led the league, but set a rookie record for receivers. Carter, who had his 6th consecutive 1,000-yard season, was 4th with 12 receiving touchdowns. Moss came in 4th for MVP voting, so of course, to no surprise, he was named NFL's Offensive Rookie of the Year with nearly 95% of the vote. There was just no question about it. And hey, Robert Smith completed this whole offense with his 1,197 yards rushing, with nearly 300 more yards receiving. And you know what? Hey, I have to give credit to this offensive line, and that's why Cunningham stayed healthy outside that one game, of course, and was able to make big plays, giving up just 25 sacks, tied with the Broncos and Jets, both of whom have Pro Bowl QBs, for 4th least in the league. However, Gary Anderson was perfect. Converts, field goals, all made, totaling 164 points. The closest he came to perfection on field goals was missing 2 with the Steelers in 1993. Oh, and that leads us, of course, to Pro Bowl selections. Let's see. How about a league-leading 10? Cunningham has 4 selections, first since 1990. Robert Smith gets his first. Rookie phenom Randy Moss, oh, you better believe it. 6th straight selection for Chris Carter. 4 kicker Gary Anderson. The 4th selection is first since leaving Pittsburgh, and his actual first selection of his career was all the way back in 1983. That offensive line gets the credit they deserve. Christie gets his first, Susie gets his second straight, and Randall McDaniel, cool name I must say, his 10th straight Pro Bowl. On the defensive side of things, John Randall gets his 6th straight, and Ed McDaniel at linebacker, a fan favorite for a few years now, gets his first, and only in, first team All-Pro selections, that would be 5. Cunningham grabbed his first after 2 second-team selections in his career. Moss, first of what would be more to come. Anderson gets his first since 1985. Randall McDaniel, his 9th straight. And for defensive tackle, John Randall, his 6th straight. Okay, well, their 556 points may be a record. I think they also set another record. Most guys named Randy or Randall in some variation. I can't resist pointing that out anymore. Second team All-Pros, count them at 4, as Stussy and Christie get recognized for their great offensive line, the former of whom getting his 2nd straight, the latter his 1st. Dwayne Rudd in his sophomore season on the linebacking core gets finally recognized, and strong safety Robert Griffith gets his 1st. Indeed, this Vikings team accomplished a lot, but now it's playoff time. So here we go. The Vikings, who of course get a bye to the divisional playoff round, will host the Arizona Cardinals, the final seeded team in the wildcard round who stunned the Dallas Cowboys in the opening round and were making headlines as a Cinderella team. They were led by QB Jake the Snake Plummer, as well as running back Adrian Morrell and receiver Frank Sanders. They had a hard-working bunch that could really shock any team. On defense, he had the great Aeneas Williams, who could make life difficult for the Vikings offensive line and, more importantly, difficult for Cunningham. And the highly underrated Kwame Lassiter in the secondary, who had 8 picks on the year. From the word go, the Cardinals didn't stand a chance. Let's face facts here. The Vikings in the first quarter, a 14-play, 80-yard drive that ate up nearly half the quarter, led to Leroy Horde plunging in from 1 yard out, opening the scoring. And in the second quarter, a 45-yard pass to Moss eventually set up a 15-yard TD pass to Glover. And an Anderson field goal made a 17-0 set up by Griffith's interception. The Cards did get on the board, however, but the Vikings would lead 24-7 at halftime after a 16-yard TD pass to Horde once again to begin the third. The Cardinals closed the gap to 10 again, but that was as good as it was get for them. The Vikings were in complete control and ended up with a huge 41-21 win. 3 touchdowns for Horde. Cunningham threw for 3 touchdowns, while Smith had 124 yards on the ground. While the Vikings defense restricted the Cards' running game, Griffith had 2 interceptions. A huge game as the Vikings play in their first NFC Championship since the 1987 season. But awaiting them was a team who only had 1 win less than they did. A big NFL comeback story, the 14-2 Atlanta Falcons. A team that just the prior year was 7-9, and the year before that just won all of 3 games. Led by another NFL QB comeback story, journeyman Chris Chandler, who played for 5 teams before arriving in Atlanta and was now a Pro Bowler. The team known as the Dirty Birds had the man who made the Dirty Bird dance popular, running back Jamal Anderson with 1,800 rushing yards, only second to Terrell Davis. You had star receiver Terrence Mathis, as well as a defense that actually overall was a lot more dynamic and some would say better than the Vikings. And they indeed had the 4th best defense in the league, thanks to linebacker Jesse Tuggle, who helped the Falcons with the 2nd best rushing defense in the game, and a great secondary led by Ray Buchanan and Eugene Robinson. They were coached by a man with 3 Super Bowl appearances under his belt, Dan Reeves. But the Vikings overall seemed like the more dominant club, so they were still favored to win this game. So here we go. 64,000 strong at the Metrodome. The Vikings looking to make their first Super Bowl appearance in Super Bowl 11. The game is underway, and on the opening drive in 13 plays, the Falcons, however, score a touchdown thanks to their star running back. But of course, it's way too early to panic, and that is definitely not what the Vikings do. Why should they? Because on the next drive, Randall to Randy, 31-yard touchdown pass. We're all tied up. It's 7-7 after 1. After Ed McDaniel recovered a fumble, Cunningham engineered a very smart drive, setting up Mr. Perfect Gary Anderson, a 29-yard field goal. It's 10-7 Vikes. Well, and then another fumble, this one caused by Orlando Thomas and recovered by Griffith. 6 plays later, Cunningham calls his own number from a yard out, 17-7 Minnesota. The Falcons' next drive produces -9 yards. Yikes. The Vikings get the ball back Anderson field goal, 20-7. Break out the champagne, boys. Cunningham was hit hard and fumbled on his own 14 with just about a minute to go in the half. And on the next play, Chandler finds Mathis for a 14-yard strike. It's 20-14, and that's how it would stay at halftime. Oh boy. Well, the Vikings, however, were dominant, but the Dirty Birds now have momentum. But it's no time to panic, however, but the Falcons do close the gap even further as Chandler engineered another drive that allowed the other Anderson, one who's also a great kicker and spells his name differently, Morton, to boot a 27-yarder. It's 20-17 for the Vikings still, but it's getting a little too close for comfort. And while that's how it would stay after 3 quarters, the Vikings were well on their way in a very long drive at the end of the quarter, which would go into the 4th, as it culminated in the end with Randall Cunningham finding Matthew Hatchett from 5 yards out, 27-17. And hey, the Falcons on the next drive closed the gap, 27-20. The Vikings, however, had the ball with 6 minutes to kill and hoped to build on their lead. And they managed to get the clock down near the 2-minute mark. Here's Gary. A 38-yard attempt. This would likely put the game out of reach. Here we go. Easy peasy. It's up. It's no good. What the f? This guy didn't miss a field goal all damn season. And he chooses now? Oh, bad omen. So the Falcons get the ball back, and with just under a minute to play, Chandler finds Mathis from 16 yards out. The game is tied, and we're going to overtime. Oh, every fan in this building is on the edge of their seat. Forget about the field goal attempt. Who cares? It's time for redemption. They can do it. The Vikings get the ball first. Surely they will only muster up a handful of plays before punting. Oh, dear. The Falcons have the ball. You can almost hear a pin drop in the Metrodome, but they are too forced to punt. Surely now the Vikings will, again, only muster up 5 plays from scrimmage before punting again. The Falcons, however, are buried back at their own 9-yard line. That's great news. Bad news is they make it to field goal range. And ironically, from 38 yards out, Morton Anderson makes the Vikings' dream season end in a nightmare. The Falcons are going to the Super Bowl. In my opinion, Gary Anderson, that is, was unfairly scapegoated here. Sure, his missed field goal, the only one he missed all damn season, was very costly and was definitely a huge reason why the Vikings lost. But I also feel the major turning point was Cunningham's fumble at the end of the first half, and that was a big momentum changer that allowed the Falcons to stay in the game all along until they finally tied it. Also, Cunningham's failure and the offense's failure overall, and it shouldn't just be on him either, to move the ball in overtime. But after all that, it was one of the most heartbreaking fashions possible to end such a great season. And also on top of that, we were robbed of what might have been an epic Super Bowl, as the Vikings could have taken on another dominant force, the defending champion Denver Broncos. We could have had Elway versus Cunningham, the dominant rusher in the league, Terrell Davis, versus the best receiving duo in the league, Carter and Moss. Whose defense was better? We'd figure that out in that game. Instead, we got a very disappointing Super Bowl, only noted for being Elway's last game, and for that big touchdown pass to Rod Smith where the Broncos dominated and won it. Despite this, however, this Vikings club is still very fondly remembered among its fans, and is historically called one of the greatest offenses in NFL history, and statistically it certainly proves that. However, in 1999 they made the choice to part with Brad Johnson and make Cunningham their starter, and at the time that happened, anyone would agree that was the right call. But it ended up being not so much so. Cunningham's injury issues reared their ugly head again. And while the Vikings still made the playoffs with a 10-6 record the next year, they managed to get by with noted cautionary tale Jeff George at quarterback, but a surprisingly decent year, as they are prepping for a new QB to take over for the future, Dante Culpepper. Cunningham left Minnesota after 1999 and only played 2 seasons after that as a backup in Dallas and in Baltimore before retiring after 2001. As for QB Brad Johnson, he became a Pro Bowl quarterback in 1999 in Washington, and also later on in Tampa, where he would lead them to a Super Bowl win, getting himself a ring. And who is he taking snaps from? Center Jeff Christie. Dennis Green left the Vikings as head coach at the end of the 2001 season. He would coach 3 seasons in Arizona later on, but left the NFL after 2006. As for that rookie, Randy Moss, well, indeed, yes, he would become a huge nuisance, but he also became one of the all-time greats. He spent a total of 7 seasons in Minnesota, had a brief stint in Oakland, and then was part of another team that came close to being perfect, the infamous 2007 Patriots. After a few years there, his antics caused him to be bounced around. He returned to Minnesota for 4 games in 2010, and a forgettable tenure with the Titans to close out that year. He made one last comeback attempt, having a so-so year with the 49ers in 2012, playing in his second Super Bowl, but he came up short, never having won one in his career. Speaking of having never won one, as of December 2022, making this video, the Vikings have yet to win one. This 1998 Vikings team bolstered 4 Hall of Famers. That amazing receiving duo of Moss and Carter both got in. Carter getting inducted in 2013, while Moss, despite his behavior, if you will, and thinking it might cost him some votes, was a first ballot inductee in 2018. While Randall McDaniel got recognition for being one of the best offensive linemen and blockers in the game for many years, well, the Wild John Randall, who was, again, one of the best defensive tackles of his time, also got his well-deserved recognition and was enshrined in Canton. But there are many still making an argument for 2 that are not in yet these days. That is, of course, it's Randall Cunningham and Gary Anderson. It's hard for Cunningham. He had a great career, and I, growing up, really liked him. And there was indeed a time between 88 and 92 where he was unarguably among the top 3 QBs in the league, despite an injury-plagued season in 1991, of course. Meaning he still had 4 amazing seasons. And of course he had that one great season in Minnesota. Some argue that 5 great seasons is just as much as some inductees have had. Some have had no more, people say. Well, people have to, however, point out his injury issues, and he was almost a non-factor at QB from 93 to 97. And of course he had a year off in 96. And again, the final 3 years of his career were nothing of note. It's the same argument for and against Giants legends and QB Phil Simms. And as for Anderson, well, the Hall of Fame sometimes takes their sweet-ass time with kickers and punters. And I wouldn't doubt that he'll probably get in one day. And what's the reason he should be in, you ask? Oh yeah, he's 3rd all time in kicking points. But again, he's one of many kickers being snubbed, so he's not alone in that regard. Well, that does it for our look at the amazing 1998 Minnesota Vikings. Close to perfect. Any other teams you'd like to see us cover? Leave a suggestion in the comments. In the meantime, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and until next time, I'll see ya!